I stood in my kitchen last Tuesday morning, watching the sunrise paint my granite countertops gold, and I realized something that chilled me to the bone. I had been living a lie for 43 years. Not just any lie, the kind that destroys everything you thought you knew about love, family, and the person sleeping next to you every single night. If you're watching this from anywhere in the world, I need you to know that what I'm about to tell you isn't fiction. This is my life, raw, ugly, and unfiltered. And if you've ever trusted someone completely, only to have that trust shattered in the most devastating way possible, then you'll understand why I had to share this story. My name is Dorothy Chen, to my friends, and I'm 71 years old. For most of my adult life, I thought I was living the American dream. Beautiful home in Westchester County, New York. 2 successful children. A husband who seemed to adore me. But sometimes the dream is just a well-crafted nightmare, and you don't wake up until it's almost too late. Richard Chen wasn't my first love, but he was supposed to be my last. We met at a hospital fundraiser in 1979. I was 37 and recently divorced, working as a pediatric nurse, trying to rebuild my life after my first marriage fell apart. Richard was this confident real estate developer, 15 years older than me, with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed to see right through my carefully constructed walls. He pursued me relentlessly, in the most charming way. Flowers delivered to the pediatric ward where I worked, each bouquet accompanied by handwritten notes that made the other nurses swoon. He'd show up at my apartment building with takeout from expensive restaurants, claiming he was too old to learn how to cook but too stubborn to give up trying to impress me. Within 6 months, I was head over heels in love with a man who seemed too good to be true. And here's something I want you to remember as this story unfolds: when someone seems too good to be true, they usually are. We married in the spring of 1980. Richard adopted my 8-year-old son Jason from my first marriage, and 2 years later, we had Melissa. To the outside world, we were the picture of suburban success. Richard's business thrived throughout the 80s and 90s. We built a stunning colonial house with a circular driveway and a pool that Jason's friends loved. Melissa grew up taking piano lessons and playing tennis at the country club. But even in those early years, there were signs. Little things that didn't quite add up. Richard would disappear for days at a time, claiming work emergencies. He received phone calls at odd hours that he'd taken his study with the door locked. There were business trips that seemed to have no paper trail, no hotel receipts, no conference materials. When I asked questions, Richard had a way of making me feel foolish for asking. He'd smile that patient smile and say, "Sweetheart, you worry too much. I'm building an empire for our family." Sometimes that requires a little discretion. He'd pull me close and kiss my forehead, and I'd feel guilty for doubting him. The thing about long marriages is that you adapt. You learn to live with the small mysteries, the white lies, the spaces your partner keeps private. You tell yourself that everyone has secrets, that perfect transparency is a myth sold by marriage counselors and romance novels. For decades, I adapted. I focused on raising Jason and Melissa, on my work at the Children's Hospital, on maintaining the beautiful life Richard had given us. I hosted dinner parties and charity events. I smiled at country club gatherings and pretended not to notice when other wives would give me pitying looks that I couldn't quite understand. The first real crack in my carefully constructed denial came in 2019, when Richard suffered what his doctors called a minor heart episode. He was 69 then, still robust and commanding, but the scare shook him. For the first time in our marriage, he seemed vulnerable, almost fragile. During his recovery, I took over more of his business correspondence. Just basic things, returning calls to contractors, dealing with property management companies. That's when I started seeing the discrepancies. Properties that didn't exist in the places he claimed to own them. Business partners whose names didn't match the names on the paperwork. Bank statements that showed massive transfers to accounts I'd never heard of. When I brought these things to Richard, he had a mild stroke. Right there in our living room, while I was holding a bank statement showing a $3 million transfer to something called Meridian Holdings LLC. He collapsed, and I spent the next 3 months nursing him back to health, too scared and too busy to pursue the questions that were eating me alive. That stroke changed everything. Richard became obsessive about protecting our family, about making sure Jason and Melissa would be taken care of if anything happened to him. He updated his will 3 times in 2 years. He set up trust funds and life insurance policies that seemed excessive, even for a wealthy man. But here's what really unsettled me: he started treating our children differently. Jason, who had always been the golden child in Richard's eyes, suddenly couldn't do anything right. Every conversation between them ended in arguments about Jason's lifestyle, his job, his girlfriend. Meanwhile, Melissa, who had been the rebellious one, the child who challenged Richard at every turn, became his confidant, his trusted advisor. The change was so dramatic that I wondered if the stroke had affected Richard's personality. But when I suggested he see a neurologist for a follow-up evaluation, he refused. Instead, he became secretive in new ways. He'd have long, whispered conversations with Melissa behind closed doors. He'd take calls in the garage or the basement, places where I couldn't accidentally overhear. I started feeling like a stranger in my own home. The final months of Richard's life were a masterclass in psychological manipulation, though I didn't recognize it at the time. He'd alternate between periods of intense affection, romantic dinners, surprise gifts, declarations of love, and cold withdrawal that left me wondering what I'd done wrong. He'd share intimate details about his childhood, stories I'd never heard in 40 years of marriage, and then clam up for days when I tried to respond with my own memories. Most troubling of all, he began asking me strange hypothetical questions. What would I do if he disappeared? How would I handle his business affairs if he couldn't? Did I trust Jason and Melissa to take care of me? The questions felt loaded, like there were right and wrong answers that would determine our future together. I should have paid more attention to what he was really asking. I should have trusted my instincts when they screamed that something was fundamentally wrong with the man I'd loved for more than 4 decades. But I didn't. Instead, I told myself that Richard was just getting older, that his health scares had made him paranoid about mortality. I convinced myself that the secrecy and the strange questions were normal for a man facing the end of his life. On March 15, 2023, Richard Chin died of what appeared to be a massive heart attack. I found him in our bed at 6:30 in the morning, peaceful and still, looking younger in death than he had in years. The paramedics who responded were kind but matter-of-fact. These things happen to men his age, especially men with his medical history. The funeral was planned quickly, efficiently, the way Richard would have wanted. Jason flew in from Seattle, where he worked as a software engineer. Melissa, who lived just 20 minutes away in Scarsdale, handled most of the arrangements with a competence that surprised me. For a woman who had always been scattered and emotional, she managed every detail of her stepfather's funeral with military precision. Standing at that graveside 4 days later, listening to the pastor speak about Richard's devotion to family and his contributions to the community, I thought I was beginning the process of grieving and healing. I thought I was saying goodbye to the great love of my life, complicated as that love had been. I had no idea that I was actually witnessing the opening act of the most sophisticated deception I could have ever imagined. And I certainly had no idea that the man I was about to bury wasn't the man I thought I'd been married to for 43 years. The morning of Richard's funeral dawned gray and drizzling, the kind of March weather that seems designed for grief. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, struggling with the clasp of the pearl necklace Richard had given me for our 20th anniversary, and I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. Melissa appeared in my doorway without knocking, something that had become a habit of hers since Richard's death. She was dressed in an elegant black suit that probably cost more than my car payment, her auburn hair pulled back in a severe chignon that made her look older than her 41 years. "Mom, you can't wear that dress," she said, eyeing my simple black sheath with disapproval. "Dad would have hated it. He always said you looked best in navy blue." I wanted to tell her that Richard was dead and wouldn't be seeing my dress, but I didn't have the energy to argue. Grief had left me hollowed out, vulnerable to everyone else's opinions about how I should mourn. So I changed into the navy dress Melissa preferred, fixed my makeup again, and tried to summon the strength to get through the next few hours. The funeral home was packed. I was amazed by how many people came to pay their respects: business associates I'd met briefly at holiday parties, neighbors from our street and 3 streets over, colleagues from the hospital where I'd worked until retirement. Richard had touched more lives than I'd realized. But as I sat in the front row, accepting condolences and handshakes, I began noticing things that felt off. Several people mentioned business dealings with Richard that didn't match what I knew about his work. A woman from the bank spoke about overseas accounts with the casual familiarity of someone who'd been managing them for years. A man in an expensive suit thanked me for Richard's generous contributions to the organization, though I had no idea what organization he meant. If you've ever felt like everyone around you was speaking in code, keeping you out of conversations about your own life, then you know the paranoid unease that was building in my chest. Every smile seemed forced, every sympathy seemed calculated. Jason sat beside me during the service, holding my hand with a gentleness that reminded me of the sweet boy he'd been when Richard first became his stepfather. At 39, Jason had grown into a quiet, thoughtful man, a programmer who preferred books to parties, who'd never married but seemed content with his solitary life in Seattle. "Mom," he whispered during the pastor's eulogy, "some of Dad's business friends are asking about his papers. They want to know about offshore accounts and investment properties. Do you know anything about that?" I squeezed his hand and shook my head. The truth was, Richard had always handled our finances. I knew about our checking account, our savings, the mortgage that had been paid off years ago. But if there were other assets, other accounts, other properties, he'd never included me in those discussions. That should have been my first real warning sign. After the service, we drove to Woodland Cemetery for the burial. It's a beautiful place, established in 1863, with rolling hills and ancient oak trees that provide shade for generations of Westchester County families. Richard had chosen his plot years earlier, a prime location on a gentle slope overlooking a small pond. The graveside service was smaller, more intimate. Just family and close friends gathered around the mahogany casket that Melissa had insisted on despite the astronomical cost. I stood between my children, grateful for their presence, trying to focus on the pastor's words about resurrection and eternal peace. That's when everything changed. As the pastor was concluding his remarks, as the funeral director was preparing to lower Richard's casket into the ground, my phone buzzed in my purse. I ignored it. Who would be texting me during my husband's funeral? But it buzzed again, and again, with an insistence that felt almost urgent. I glanced around, hoping no one had noticed, but the other mourners seemed focused on the ceremony. Even Jason and Melissa were staring at the casket, lost in their own thoughts. So I quietly slipped my phone from my purse and checked the screen. The text was from a number I didn't recognize. "I'm alive. I'm not in the coffin." My heart stopped. Literally stopped for what felt like a full minute while my brain tried to process what I was reading. I looked up at the casket, then back at my phone, wondering if I was hallucinating from stress and grief. Before I could make sense of the first message, another one appeared. "Who are you?" I had typed back, my fingers moving before my rational mind could stop them. The response came immediately. "I can't say. They are watching us. Don't trust the children." I felt the blood drain from my face. The phone nearly slipped from my trembling hands. I looked around the gathering, expecting to see someone watching me, someone with their phone out, but everyone appeared to be respectfully focused on the burial service. "Don't trust the children." The words echoed in my mind as I stared at Jason and Melissa, both of whom seemed completely absorbed in the funeral proceedings. Jason's face was stoic, the way it had been since childhood whenever he was processing difficult emotions. Melissa was crying quietly, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. They looked like grieving children saying goodbye to their stepfather. They looked normal, devastated, genuine. But the text message had planted a seed of doubt that began growing with terrifying speed. Why had Melissa taken charge of all the funeral arrangements so quickly, so efficiently? Why had she insisted on a closed casket when I'd wanted one last look at Richard's face? Why had Jason been asking about overseas accounts and business associates I'd never heard of? I slipped the phone back into my purse, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I tried to focus on the pastor's final blessing, on the mechanical sound of the casket being lowered into the earth, on the ritual of throwing handfuls of soil onto the mahogany lid. But all I could think about was that impossible message, I'm alive. I'm not in the coffin. As the ceremony concluded and people began drifting away, offering final condolences and promises to check on me in the coming weeks, I felt like I was watching everything through thick glass. The sounds were muffled, the colors seemed washed out, and nothing felt quite real. Melissa came to stand beside me as the grave workers began filling in the hole. Mom, we need to go back to the house. People are expecting food, and I ordered enough for 50. I nodded absently, still staring at the mound of fresh earth that supposedly covered my husband's remains. Mel, did the funeral director let you see? Did you actually see Dad's body before they closed the casket? She looked at me with concern. Mom, you specifically said you didn't want to see him. You said you wanted to remember him alive. Don't you remember? But I didn't remember saying that. In fact, I distinctly remembered wanting one final goodbye, one last look at Richard's face. Melissa had been the one who'd argued against it, who'd said it would be too traumatic for me. Besides, she continued, linking her arm through mine, the funeral director said the heart attack had changed his appearance. It wouldn't have been the way you'd want to remember him. Jason approached from the other side, and together my children guided me away from the grave site toward the waiting car. They were solicitous, gentle, everything you'd want from children helping their mother through the worst day of her life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they were also watching me carefully, monitoring my reactions, making sure I didn't stray from some script I wasn't aware of. The reception at our house was a blur of casseroles and condolence cards, of people sharing memories about Richard that often didn't match my memories of him. I smiled and nodded and accepted hugs, but I was operating on autopilot. My mind was entirely focused on that text message and what it might mean. After everyone left, after Jason and Melissa had cleaned up the kitchen and packed the leftover food, I finally had a moment alone to process what had happened. I sat in Richard's study, surrounded by his books and his desk accessories, and pulled out my phone to read the messages again. They were still there. I'm alive. I'm not in the coffin. I can't say. They are watching us. Don't trust the children. I tried calling the number, but it went straight to a generic voicemail that didn't identify the caller. I tried texting back, but my messages showed as undelivered. As I sat there in the growing darkness, staring at those impossible words, I began to understand that my life as I'd known it was over. Either I was losing my mind from grief, or everything I'd believed about my husband's death was a lie. And if it was a lie, then the two people I trusted most in the world, my own children, might be the ones lying to me. The 3 weeks following Richard's funeral passed in a haze of administrative tasks and sleepless nights. I threw myself into the mundane business of death, canceling credit cards, updating insurance policies, dealing with Social Security paperwork. Anything to avoid thinking about those text messages that had shattered my understanding of reality. But you can only distract yourself for so long before the questions demand answers. I started small, telling myself I was just being thorough in handling Richard's affairs. I made a list of all his business associates, all the companies he'd mentioned over the years, all the properties I knew he owned. Then I began making phone calls. The first discrepancy I discovered was about a strip mall in Albany that Richard had supposedly owned for 20 years. According to my records, it generated steady rental income that was deposited directly into our joint account every month. But when I called the property management company, They told me the building had been sold in 2018. Mrs. Chen, your husband received a very generous offer from a development company, the manager explained. He was quite pleased with the sale price, if I recall correctly. We sent all the paperwork to his office address in Manhattan. Richard had never mentioned selling that property. And what Manhattan office? His business had always been run from the home office in our basement. I hung up the phone with hands that were starting to shake again, the same way they'd shaken at the funeral. If you've ever had the feeling that your entire life was built on shifting sand, then you'll understand the vertigo I was experiencing. Every answer led to 3 new questions, and every question made me doubt something else I'd believed to be true. The Manhattan office address led me down a rabbit hole that consumed the next week of my life. I took the train into the city, something I hadn't done alone in years, and found myself standing in front of a gleaming office tower on East 54th Street. According to the building directory, Chen Holdings LLC occupied Suite 2847. I'd never heard of Chen Holdings LLC. The elevator ride to the 28th floor felt like ascending into another dimension. How could my husband have maintained a Manhattan office for who knows how many years without ever mentioning it to me? How could there be a company called Chen Holdings that apparently used our name but operated without my knowledge? Suite 2847 was locked, with no nameplate on the door. The office manager for the floor informed me that the space had been vacated 2 months earlier, right around the time of Richard's minor heart episode. The tenant left instructions that any mail should be forwarded to a Melissa Chen in Scarsdale, she told me. Same last name as yours. Daughter, maybe? My daughter had been receiving Richard's business mail for 2 months. My daughter, who had planned his funeral with suspicious efficiency, who had insisted on a closed casket, who had taken charge of details I should have been handling. That night, I called Jason in Seattle. We'd spoken several times since the funeral, brief conversations about how I was coping, whether I needed help with anything. But this time, I had specific questions. Jason, did Dad ever mention a Manhattan office to you? Or a company called Chen Holdings? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mom, why are you asking about Dad's business stuff? Shouldn't Melissa be handling all that? Why would Melissa be handling it instead of me? Another pause. Well, she was Dad's business partner, wasn't she? I mean, she's been working with him for years. Business partner. My daughter had been Richard's business partner, and I'd known nothing about it. I thought Melissa worked in event planning, organizing corporate retreats and charity galas. I thought her success and expensive lifestyle came from her own talents and hard work. Jason, I need you to be honest with me. How much do you know about Dad's business? About properties and accounts and things I might not know about? The silence stretched so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Jason spoke, and his voice sounded strained. Mom, I think you need to talk to Melissa. This isn't my area, and I don't want to say the wrong thing. After I hung up, I sat in Richard's study and stared at the bookshelves that lined the walls. For 43 years, I'd thought this room represented my husband's interests and personality. Books about real estate development, biographies of successful entrepreneurs, novels about World War II. But now I wondered how much of it was performance, a carefully constructed set designed to support whatever role Richard had been playing in our marriage. I pulled books randomly from the shelves, and loose papers fell out of several of them. Business cards for companies I'd never heard of. Phone numbers written on scraps of paper with no names attached. A bank statement for an account in the Cayman Islands showing a balance of over $2 million. $2 million in an offshore account, and I'd been clipping coupons and watching our grocery budget. The next morning, I drove to Melissa's house in Scarsdale. It was a beautiful colonial, bigger than the house she'd grown up in, with a manicured lawn and luxury cars in the driveway. I'd always been proud of her success, impressed by how well she'd done for herself as a single woman in her early 40s. Now I wondered how much of her success had been subsidized by Richard's secret empire. Melissa answered the door in yoga clothes, looking surprised to see me. Mom! You should have called first. I'm just heading to a class. We need to talk, Mel. About Dad's business. About Chin Holdings and the Manhattan office and the mail that's been forwarded to you. Her face went through a series of micro-expressions, surprise, calculation, resignation, before settling on concern. Mom, you look terrible. Have you been sleeping? Eating? It was classic deflection, the kind of response you give when you're buying time to think. I'd used the same technique with my own patients' parents when they asked difficult questions about their children's conditions. I'm fine. I need answers. She stepped back to let me in, but her body language was tense, guarded. We sat in her pristine living room, surrounded by expensive furniture and artwork that I was seeing with new eyes. How does an event planner afford a Picasso print and Italian leather sofas? Dad asked me to help with some business things after his first heart episode, Melissa began carefully. He was worried about leaving you with complicated finances if something happened to him. What kind of business things? Property management, mostly. Dealing with tenants and maintenance issues. You hate that stuff, Mom. He was trying to protect you from the headaches. It sounded reasonable. It even sounded loving. But it didn't explain the offshore accounts or the Manhattan office or the text messages at the funeral. Mel, I need to see the records. All of them. I need to understand what Dad was doing, what assets exist, what I'm supposed to do now. She nodded sympathetically. Of course. But it's complicated, and some of it is tied up in legal issues that the lawyers need to sort out first. Dad was in the middle of some big deals when he died. What lawyers? The estate attorneys. They're handling everything according to Dad's will. You don't need to worry about any of it. But I did need to worry about it, because increasingly, I suspected that everyone around me knew more about my own life than I did. And if someone had sent me those text messages at the funeral, someone claiming to be Richard, someone warning me not to trust my children, then the people I was depending on for answers might be the last people I should trust. That afternoon, I went to see Howard Brennan, the family attorney who had handled Richard's will and our various legal needs over the years. Howard was in his 70s, a contemporary of Richard's who had always treated me with the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that made me feel both respected and patronized. Dorothy, my dear, you should be at home resting, he said, ushering me into his office. Melissa has been handling all the estate matters beautifully. There's no need for you to burden yourself with these details. Howard, I want to see Richard's will. The actual document, not just a summary. He looked uncomfortable. Well, of course, that's your right. But it's quite lengthy, and some of the language is technical. Perhaps Melissa could walk you through it? I want to see it now. Please. Howard produced a thick document that I read with growing disbelief. Richard had indeed left me our house and a comfortable amount in our joint accounts. But the bulk of his estate, including properties I'd never heard of and businesses I didn't know existed, was being held in trust for Jason and Melissa, with Melissa serving as the executor. This says I have to get Melissa's approval to access certain funds, I said, pointing to a paragraph that made my head spin. It says she has discretionary authority over my living expenses. It's just a formality, Dorothy. Richard wanted to make sure you were protected from financial predators, people who might try to take advantage of a widow. Melissa will never deny you anything you need. But the woman who had been intercepting Richard's business mail, who had insisted on a closed casket funeral, who lived in a house I now suspected was purchased with money from accounts I'd never known about, that woman now controlled my financial future. As I drove home from Howard's office, I couldn't stop thinking about those text messages. I'm alive. I'm not in the coffin. Don't trust the children. What if they weren't the ravings of a grief-stricken imagination? What if someone who knew the truth about Richard's death had been trying to warn me? And what if the people I loved most in the world were the ones I should fear most? I've always believed that the truth has a way of surfacing, like oil on water. You can try to cover it up, dilute it, ignore it, but eventually it rises to the top where everyone can see it. The problem is, sometimes by the time the truth surfaces, it's too late to do anything about it. I was determined not to let that happen to me. The morning after my disturbing visit with Howard Brennan, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to investigate my own life. I was going to treat my marriage, my children, and my husband's death like a puzzle that needed solving. And I was going to do it without telling anyone what I was doing. If you've ever felt like you were living in a house of cards built by other people, then you'll understand why I felt so methodical and calm once I made this decision. The panic and confusion of the past few weeks crystallized into something sharper: determination. I started with Richard's computer. He'd always been protective of his laptop, taking it with him when he traveled, keeping it password protected even at home. After his death, Melissa had offered to help me clean up his digital affairs, but I'd told her I wasn't ready to deal with it yet. Now I was grateful for that delay. The laptop was still sitting on his desk in the study, exactly where he'd left it the night before he died. I'd been avoiding it, treating it like a shrine to his memory. But now I opened it and stared at the password prompt, trying to think like my husband. Richard was methodical about security, but he was also practical. He wouldn't use a password so obscure that he'd forget it, but it wouldn't be something obvious like our anniversary or birth date. I tried a dozen combinations before something occurred to me: what if he'd hidden the password in plain sight? I started examining the objects on his desk more carefully. His Mont Blanc pen set, a gift from the children one Christmas. A crystal paperweight with our wedding photo inside. A small wooden box that held his cufflinks and watch. And tucked under his desk blotter, a business card for a restaurant in Manhattan called Meridian 7. Meridian 7. I remembered seeing Meridian Holdings on one of those bank statements I'd found in his books. I typed it in, and the computer unlocked. What I found in Richard's files made me understand that I'd been married to a stranger. There were folders labeled with code names: Project Sandpiper, Blackwater Investments, Northern Lights LLC. Each folder contained documents that painted a picture of a business empire I never could have imagined. Real estate holdings in 12 states. Investment accounts in banks I'd never heard of. Partnership agreements with people whose names meant nothing to me. But it was the folder labeled Family Insurance that made my blood run cold. Inside were life insurance policies, not just the one I knew about, but 5 additional policies totaling over $8 million. All with different companies, all taken out within the past 3 years, all listing Melissa as the primary beneficiary. $8 million in life insurance on a man who was supposedly dying of natural causes. I printed everything, my hands shaking so badly that I dropped papers all over the study floor. Some rational part of my brain was screaming that there must be innocent explanations for all of this. Wealthy people have complex financial arrangements. Maybe Richard had been protecting us in ways I didn't understand. But then I found the email folder labeled M Confidential. The emails between Richard and Melissa went back 5 years, and they read like correspondence between business partners, not stepfather and stepdaughter. They discussed the old woman, me, and whether I was getting suspicious. They debated the timing of something called the transition and worried about Jason's potential interference. One email from Melissa, dated just 2 weeks before Richard's death, chilled me to the bone. The doctor says the dosage adjustment should make it look completely natural. Are you sure you want to go through with this? There might be other ways. Richard's response: we've come too far to back out now. Just make sure Dorothy doesn't ask too many questions afterward. Keep her focused on grieving, not investigating. I had to run to the bathroom to vomit. When I came back to the study, I forced myself to keep reading. There were emails about funeral arrangements made weeks before Richard's death. Discussions about managing Dorothy's emotional state during the transition period. Plans for gradually limiting my access to family finances while making it seem like loving protection. And in the most recent email, sent just 3 days before Richard died, a single line from Melissa that made everything clear: the cremation has to be immediate after the viewing. We can't risk an autopsy. But Richard hadn't been cremated. He'd been buried in that expensive mahogany casket at Woodland Cemetery. Why had the plan changed? I was so absorbed in reading that I didn't hear the front door open. Didn't hear footsteps in the hallway. Didn't realize I wasn't alone until Melissa's voice behind me said, "Mom, what are you doing?" I spun around, and there was my daughter standing in the study doorway, still in her yoga clothes from earlier, but her expression was nothing like the concerned daughter who'd tried to deflect my questions that morning. This was the face of someone who'd been caught. "I came back to check on you after my class," she said, stepping into the room. Her eyes swept over the printed emails scattered across Richard's desk. "I was worried when you left so abruptly earlier." I tried to gather the papers casually, but my movements were too quick, too panicked. "I was just trying to understand Dad's business arrangements." "Those are private communications, Mom. You shouldn't be reading them. They're communications about murdering my husband." The words hung in the air between us like poison gas. Melissa's face went very still, and for the first time in my daughter's life, I was genuinely afraid of her. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly. Grief can cause paranoid thoughts, delusions. Maybe you should talk to someone." But I wasn't delusional, and we both knew it. "You were planning to cremate him immediately. Why didn't you?" She moved closer to the desk, and I realized she was positioning herself between me and the door. The funeral home had a scheduling conflict. We had to adjust the plans. Or maybe you couldn't risk cremating an empty coffin. The mask finally dropped completely from Melissa's face. What I saw underneath was cold, calculating, and utterly without remorse. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Then explain it to me. Explain the life insurance policies. Explain the emails about dosage adjustments and making it look natural. Explain how you've been intercepting Dad's business mail and managing offshore accounts I never knew existed." Instead of explaining, Melissa pulled out her phone and made a call. "Jason, you need to get here now. Mom's having some kind of breakdown." She paused, listening. "No, it's serious. She's making wild accusations. I think we need to consider getting her some professional help." Professional help. In other words, they were going to have me declared mentally incompetent so they could control the narrative and access to Richard's estate without interference. After she hung up, we stared at each other across the desk covered with evidence of their conspiracy. I realized that everything I'd believed about my children, about my family, had been as much of an illusion as everything I'd believed about my husband. "Why?" I asked, and I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Why would you do this to me?" Melissa sat down in Richard's chair, casual and comfortable, as if she'd always belonged there. "You wouldn't understand, Mom. You've never had to worry about money, never had to plan for the future. Dad and I were building something bigger than your little suburban fairy tale. He was my husband. He was your meal ticket," she corrected. "And mine. Do you know how much it costs to maintain the lifestyle you've enjoyed all these years? The house, the country club, the vacations, my education, Jason's education. Dad's legitimate real estate business barely covered half of it. So what was the other half?" She smiled, and it was the most chilling expression I'd ever seen on my daughter's face. "Let's just say Dad was very good at making dirty money clean. Very good at helping certain people move assets around without attracting attention from inconvenient government agencies. Money laundering. My husband had been laundering money for criminals, and my daughter had been his partner in crime. And when he wanted out? Who says he wanted out? This was Dad's idea from the beginning. The heart attack, the stroke, even his death, it was all planned. A way to disappear with a substantial nest egg while leaving you with enough to live comfortably and us with enough to continue the business. But the text messages at the funeral. What text messages? Melissa's eyes narrowed dangerously. Mom, you're starting to worry me. Are you sure you're not imagining things? I heard Jason's car in the driveway, and I realized I had maybe 2 minutes before I was outnumbered by the two people who had apparently been planning to destroy my life for years. I quickly gathered as many of the printed emails as I could, stuffing them into my purse. I'm going home, I announced, standing up. I don't think that's a good idea, Melissa said, rising as well. You're clearly having some kind of episode. Maybe you should stay here tonight where I can keep an eye on you. But I was already moving toward the door, and she couldn't stop me without physically restraining me, something that would be hard to explain to Jason when he arrived. I made it to my car just as Jason's rental was pulling into the driveway. Through my windshield, I watched my son get out of his car and embrace his sister on her front porch. They looked like loving siblings comforting each other during a family crisis. They looked like the children I'd raised, the children I'd sacrificed for, the children I'd trusted with my life. As I drove home, I kept checking my rearview mirror to see if they were following me. They weren't, which somehow made everything worse. It meant they weren't worried about what I'd discovered. It meant they had a plan for dealing with me. That night, I sat in my locked bedroom with Richard's printed emails spread across my comforter, trying to piece together the full scope of what had been done to me. The evidence was overwhelming, but it raised more questions than it answered. If Richard had faked his death, where was he now? Who had sent those text messages at the funeral? Why hadn't the cremation plan worked? And most importantly, what were Jason and Melissa planning to do about their increasingly suspicious and potentially dangerous mother? I realized I needed help, but I couldn't trust anyone in my immediate circle. Howard Brennan was clearly in on the conspiracy, or at least willfully blind to it. The police would think I was a delusional widow who couldn't accept her husband's death. My friends would side with my children, who seemed so caring and concerned about my mental state. But there was one person who might be able to help me, someone who had resources and investigative skills and no reason to protect my family's secrets. Someone who had called me 6 months earlier with questions about Richard's business that I dismissed at the time as invasive and inappropriate. Detective Ray Kowalski from the County Financial Crimes Division had been investigating a money laundering operation with ties to several real estate developers in the area. He'd wanted to interview Richard, but Richard's health problems had prevented it from happening. At the time, I'd been offended that anyone would suggest my husband was involved in criminal activity. Now I was praying that Detective Kowalski was still working the case, still looking for answers about the financial network that had apparently consumed my husband and children. As I drifted off to sleep that night, clutching my phone and the printed evidence of my family's betrayal, I made a decision that would either save my life or destroy what was left of it. I was going to fight back. But I was also starting to understand something that terrified me more than the money laundering or the life insurance fraud or even the possibility that my husband had faked his own death. If Melissa was right, if Richard had planned his disappearance from the beginning, then those text messages at the funeral hadn't come from him. Someone else knew the truth about what had happened. Someone else was watching me, warning me, trying to protect me from my own children. Someone who knew that the man in that coffin wasn't my husband, and who might know where my husband really was. Detective Ray Kowalski looked exactly like I remembered him, a stocky Polish-American man in his 50s with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much human greed. His office in the county building was cramped and cluttered, with files stacked on every available surface and a coffee maker that looked older than my marriage. "Mrs. Chen," he said, standing when I entered. "I have to admit, I was surprised to hear from you. When we spoke last year, you were pretty clear that you didn't want to discuss your husband's business activities." I sat down across from his desk, my purse heavy with the printed emails that had shattered my understanding of my life. Detective, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you think my husband faked his own death? He leaned back in his chair and studied my face for a long moment. What makes you ask that question, Mrs. Chen? So I told him everything. The discrepancies I'd discovered in Richard's business records. The Manhattan office I'd never known about. The life insurance policies listing Melissa as beneficiary. The emails discussing dosage adjustments and making Richard's death look natural. The text messages at the funeral. When I finished, Detective Kowalski was quiet for several minutes, making notes on a yellow legal pad. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression that mixed sympathy with professional concern. Mrs. Chen, what you're describing sounds like a sophisticated insurance fraud scheme, possibly combined with money laundering and tax evasion. These are serious federal crimes that my department has been investigating for over 2 years. Then why didn't you arrest Richard when you first suspected him? Because Richard Chen was never our primary suspect. He was what we call a facilitator, someone who helps move dirty money through legitimate real estate transactions. We were after the people he was working for, the ones generating the dirty money in the first place. He opened a thick file folder and pulled out a surveillance photo that made my heart skip a beat. It was Richard, but not the Richard the first knew. This Richard was meeting with a man in an expensive suit outside a restaurant in Manhattan. The timestamp showed the photo had been taken just 6 weeks before his supposed death. Your husband was cooperating with our investigation, Mrs. Chen. He'd agreed to wear a wire, to help us gather evidence against his business partners. The arrangement was that he'd serve minimal jail time in exchange for his cooperation. The room seemed to spin around me. You're saying Richard was working with the police? He was scheduled to testify before a grand jury 2 days after he died. 2 days. Richard had died 2 days before he was supposed to expose the criminal network he'd been part of. That couldn't be a coincidence. Detective, do you think someone killed him to prevent his testimony? Kowalski's expression became very serious. Mrs. Chen, I'm going to share something with you that's not public knowledge, but I think you need to know. We requested an autopsy on your husband's body. But there wasn't an autopsy. The funeral director said the cause of death was clear, that the body was released for burial before the coroner could examine it. Someone with authority over the funeral arrangements expedited the process through channels that bypassed normal procedure. Melissa. Melissa had expedited Richard's burial to prevent an autopsy. But that meant she'd known the autopsy might reveal evidence of murder. However, Kowalski continued, we did manage to get tissue samples from the funeral home before the burial. Samples that showed significant levels of digitalis in your husband's system. Digitalis? It's a heart medication that can be lethal in large doses. In someone with Richard's medical history, a digitalis overdose would cause symptoms identical to a massive heart attack. It's actually a fairly sophisticated method of murder because it mimics natural causes. I felt like I was drowning in information that redefined everything I thought I knew about my husband's death. So someone did murder him. That's what the evidence suggests. The question is who had access to Richard, who knew about his cooperation with law enforcement, and who had the most to gain from his death. The answer seemed obvious, but I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. My daughter. My daughter had murdered my husband to prevent him from testifying and to collect on $8 million in life insurance policies. Detective, there's something else. At the funeral, I received text messages from someone claiming to be Richard. Someone who said he was still alive, who warned me not to trust my children. Kowalski leaned forward, suddenly very alert. Do you still have those messages? I pulled out my phone and showed him the conversation. He studied the screen intently, then handed it back to me. Mrs. Chen, that phone number belongs to a burner phone purchased with cash in Midtown Manhattan 3 days before your husband's funeral. We've been trying to trace the purchaser, but the store's security footage was conveniently corrupted. So someone was definitely trying to contact me. Someone who knew about the fake death story. Or someone who wanted you to think your husband was still alive. Mrs. Chen, I need you to consider the possibility that those messages weren't sent to help you, but to manipulate you. The implications hit me like a physical blow. You think Melissa sent them? I think someone wanted you to start questioning your husband's death, but in a way that would make you seem paranoid and unstable if you tried to share your suspicions with anyone else. Think about it, mysterious text messages claiming your dead husband is alive? Most people would assume you were having a grief-induced breakdown. It was diabolical in its cleverness. Create just enough doubt to make me start investigating, but frame that investigation as the delusions of an unstable widow. If I tried to tell anyone about the text messages, they'd suggest I get psychological help. Meanwhile, my investigation would uncover evidence of financial irregularities that my children could blame on Richard's business activities, positioning themselves as innocent victims of their stepfather's criminal associates. Detective, what should I do? If my daughter killed my husband, if she's planning to have me declared incompetent so she can control his estate, what options do I have? Kowalski closed the file folder and looked at me with the kind of directness that told me he was about to say something I didn't want to hear. Mrs. Chen, I'm going to be blunt with you. The evidence we have against your husband's murder is circumstantial. The digitalis could have been administered by anyone with access to his medication or food. The life insurance policies are suspicious but not illegal. The emails you found could be interpreted as business discussions rather than murder plans. But surely the combination of all these factors would be enough to open a formal investigation, yes. But it wouldn't be enough to guarantee convictions, especially against defendants with the financial resources to hire excellent lawyers. I felt my last hope slipping away. So they're going to get away with it? Not necessarily. Mrs. Chen, I believe your husband's murder was committed to prevent his testimony about the money laundering operation. If we can gather enough evidence to prosecute that original case, the murder charges might follow naturally. What kind of evidence? The kind your husband was supposed to provide before he died. Financial records, communication logs, details about how the money moved through his real estate transactions. He paused, looking at me intently. The kind of evidence that might still exist in his personal files, his computer, his business records. I understood what he was asking. He wanted me to become an informant, to gather evidence against my own daughter and possibly my son. He wanted me to risk my life to finish what my husband had started. Detective, if I agree to help you, if I try to gather this evidence, what happens if they suspect what I'm doing? His expression became very grim. Mrs. Chen, I'm going to tell you something that might sound paranoid, but I think you need to hear it. In the 2 years we've been investigating this money laundering network, 3 potential witnesses have died under circumstances that appeared to be natural causes or accidents. Your husband makes 4. You think they'll try to kill me too? I think that if your daughter is capable of murdering the man who raised her, she's capable of anything. And if she's already planning to have you declared incompetent, she might see eliminating you entirely as a simpler solution. I sat in that cramped office, surrounded by files documenting human greed and betrayal, and realized that I was facing a choice between terrible options. I could walk away, accept that my husband had been murdered and my daughter was a killer, and hope that keeping quiet would keep me safe. Or I could fight back, risk my life to gather evidence against my own children, and possibly prevent them from destroying other families the way they destroyed mine. If you've ever had to choose between cowardice and courage when both options might get you killed, then you'll understand why I sat there for so long without speaking. Finally, I looked up at Detective Kowalski and said, "What do you need me to do?" He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small electronic device that looked like a hearing aid. This is a recording device, completely undetectable when worn properly. I need you to have conversations with your daughter and son about their father's business, about his death, about their plans for managing his estate. I need them to say something incriminating that we can use in court. And if they realize what I'm doing? Then you call this number immediately, he said, handing me a business card with a phone number written on the back. Day or night, someone will answer. We'll have you in protective custody within an hour. As I left his office, the recording device hidden in my purse and the weight of betrayal heavy on my shoulders, I realized that my real education was just beginning. I was about to learn things about deception and manipulation that I'd never wanted to know, about my own capacity for vengeance that I'd never suspected. But I was also about to discover something else, the identity of the person who had sent those text messages at Richard's funeral. Someone who knew the truth about my husband's death and who might hold the key to everything. The recording device Detective Kowalski gave me was smaller than a Bluetooth earpiece and virtually invisible when positioned correctly behind my ear. For 3 days, I practiced wearing it around the house, getting used to the slight pressure and learning to activate it with a casual touch that would look like I was just brushing my hair back. I felt like a spy in my own life, which I suppose I was. The plan was simple: invite both children over for Sunday dinner, the way we used to do when Richard was alive. Create a comfortable, familiar environment where they'd feel safe to talk about their plans for managing his estate, their concerns about my mental state, their version of what had happened to their stepfather. But as I prepared for what might be the most dangerous evening of my life, I kept thinking about those text messages at the funeral. Detective Kowalski believed Melissa had sent them to manipulate me, to make me seem paranoid while encouraging me to uncover evidence that would implicate Richard rather than his murderers. The problem with that theory was timing. The messages had been sent during the burial service, when Melissa was standing right beside me. I would have noticed if she'd been using her phone. So who had been watching us at that cemetery? Who knew enough about the fake death scenario to use it as bait? And why warn me not to trust my children unless they genuinely wanted to protect me? Sunday morning, I called both Jason and Melissa to invite them for dinner. Jason, still in town dealing with what he called Dad's business complications, agreed immediately. Melissa was more hesitant. Mom, I'm worried about having you cook for us. You've been under so much stress lately, and yesterday when I stopped by, you seemed so agitated. I'm fine, Mel. I just want to have a normal family dinner. We need to start healing, and we need to figure out how to move forward together. She agreed, but I could hear the calculation in her voice. She was probably thinking that a family dinner would give her the opportunity to assess my mental state and plan her next move. I spent the afternoon cooking Richard's favorite meal, pot roast with red wine, mashed potatoes, green beans with almonds. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was preparing a memorial dinner for a man who might still be alive while wearing a wire to record his murderers. Jason arrived first, carrying a bottle of wine and looking genuinely concerned about my well-being. For a moment, seeing his familiar face at my front door, I almost lost my resolve. This was the little boy I'd rocked to sleep after nightmares, the teenager I'd driven to soccer practice and piano lessons, the young man I'd helped through his first heartbreak. But then I remembered the emails I'd found on Richard's computer, the casual way Jason had referred to Melissa as Richard's business partner, his suggestion that I should let my daughter handle all the financial arrangements. Mom, you look good, he said, hugging me carefully as if I might break. I was worried after what Melissa told me about your episode the other day. Episode. That's what they were calling my discovery of their murder plot. I activated the recording device with a subtle brush of my hair and led him into the living room. I've been thinking a lot about Dad's business, I said, offering him a glass of wine. There's so much I didn't know about his work, so many properties and accounts that I'm just now discovering. Did you know he owned real estate in 12 different states? Jason looked uncomfortable. Mom, you don't need to worry about any of that. Melissa's handling all the business stuff. But Jason, I'm his widow. Shouldn't I be involved in understanding what he left behind? It's complicated, Mom. Dad's business relationships were complex. Some of the people he worked with aren't the kind of people you'd want to deal with directly. There it was. Jason knew about the money laundering, knew about Richard's criminal associates. He was trying to protect me from them, but he was also trying to keep me from understanding the full scope of what my husband and daughter had been doing. Melissa arrived 20 minutes later, looking elegant in a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. She kissed my cheek and complimented the smell coming from the kitchen, playing the role of loving daughter perfectly. Over dinner, I steered the conversation toward Richard's business affairs, asking innocent questions about properties and investments while the recording device captured every word. Jason remained cautious in his responses, but Melissa was more forthcoming, perhaps because she thought she was managing my understanding of the situation. Dad was involved in some very lucrative partnerships, she explained, cutting her pot roast with surgical precision. International investors who needed help placing their money in stable American real estate markets. International investors? Wealthy people from countries with unstable economies. They'd invest in Dad's development projects, and he'd help them secure their assets in American properties. It sounded almost legitimate the way she described it, but I knew from Detective Kowalski's briefing that unstable economies was code for criminal enterprises, and securing assets meant laundering dirty money. Melissa, I found some emails on Dad's computer that mentioned you as his business partner. I didn't realize you were so involved in his work. She exchanged a quick glance with Jason, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head, warning her to be careful. I helped with some administrative tasks after his first heart attack, she said smoothly. Dad was worried about leaving you with complicated business arrangements you wouldn't understand. What kind of administrative tasks? Coordinating with property managers, dealing with international banking requirements, managing correspondence with investors. Boring stuff that you wouldn't want to handle anyway. But I pressed on, emboldened by the knowledge that everything was being recorded. Mel, some of those emails talked about the old woman and the transition. Were you and Dad planning something I should know about? Jason set down his fork and looked directly at me. Mom, why are you asking these questions? What are you really trying to find out? The directness of his question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on getting them to incriminate themselves that I'd forgotten how well my children knew me. Jason could always tell when I was fishing for information. I'm trying to understand my own life, I said, which was completely true. I'm trying to understand why my husband had $8 million in life insurance policies I never knew about, why he owned a Manhattan office I never visited, why he was apparently laundering money for international criminals. The silence that followed was deafening. Melissa and Jason stared at each other, then at me, clearly recalibrating their assessment of how much I knew and how dangerous I'd become. Mom, Melissa said finally, her voice very gentle and very dangerous, where did you get that information? From Dad's computer. From his email accounts and his business files. You shouldn't have been going through his private correspondence. He was my husband. Nothing should have been private from me. Jason leaned forward, his expression intense. Mom, some of Dad's business associates are not good people. If you start digging into his affairs, asking questions, making accusations, you could put yourself in serious danger. Are you threatening me, Jason? I'm trying to protect you. We both are. But Melissa's next words revealed the truth about their protection. Mom, I think you need to see a doctor. This paranoia, these wild theories about Dad's business, this obsession with conspiracy theories, it's not healthy. I think you might be having some kind of breakdown. There it was. The plan to have me declared mentally incompetent, delivered with perfect daughterly concern while being recorded by a federal investigation device. I'm not having a breakdown, Melissa. I'm having a revelation. She reached across the table and took my hand in what would have looked like a gesture of comfort to any observer. But her grip was firm, controlling, and her voice dropped to a whisper that might not be picked up by the recording device. Mom, you need to stop this investigation right now. You need to accept that Dad died of natural causes, that his business affairs are being handled appropriately, and that your job is to grieve and heal. If you don't stop asking questions, if you don't stop making trouble, there are going to be consequences. What kind of consequences? She squeezed my hand harder, hard enough to leave marks. The kind that could be very difficult for an elderly woman living alone in a big house to survive. Jason looked alarmed. Mel, don't. Don't what? Don't tell Mom the truth. She wants to know about Dad's business, about the people he worked with, about what happens to people who ask too many questions about things that don't concern them. The mask had finally dropped completely. This wasn't my daughter speaking, this was a woman who had committed murder and was prepared to commit it again to protect her interests. I pulled my hand free and stood up from the table. I think you should both leave now. We're not going anywhere, Melissa said, also standing. Not until we figure out what to do about this situation. That's when I realized that Sunday dinner had been a trap, but not the one I'd planned. They hadn't come to my house to be recorded making incriminating statements. They'd come to assess how much I knew and to decide whether I could be managed or whether I needed to be eliminated. And based on Melissa's expression, they'd apparently decided on elimination. Jason moved to block the doorway leading to the front hall, while Melissa stepped closer to me, her hand moving toward her purse in a way that made my blood run cold. Mom, she said softly, I'm sorry it has to be this way. I really did hope we could manage this situation without anyone else getting hurt. But as she reached into her purse, my phone buzzed with a text message. Without thinking, I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. The message was from the same unknown number that had contacted me at Richard's funeral. Police are outside. Tell them about the digitalis in Melissa's purse. I looked up at my daughter, who was now holding a small vial of clear liquid, and understood that someone had been watching us, protecting me, waiting for exactly this moment. Someone who knew about the digitalis, who knew about the police surveillance, who was orchestrating a confrontation that would finally expose the truth. And in that instant, I realized who had been sending those messages all along. The pounding on my front door came at exactly the right moment, just as Melissa was advancing toward me with what I now knew was a vial of digitalis, the same poison that had killed Richard. Jason spun around, panic replacing the cold calculation that had been in his eyes moments before. How did they, he started, but Melissa cut him off. It doesn't matter. We have to get rid of this, she said, moving toward the kitchen sink with the vial. But I was closer, and 43 years of marriage to a man who kept secrets had taught me to be quick when opportunities arose. I grabbed the vial from her hand just as Detective Kowalski's voice boomed from the front hallway. Mrs. Chen. We're coming in. They'd been listening to the recording device the entire time. They'd heard Melissa's threat, heard her admission about the digitalis, heard everything we needed for a conviction. As the police flooded into my dining room, I stood there holding the evidence of my husband's murder while my children, the children I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, were read their rights and handcuffed at the table where we'd shared thousands of family meals. But even as I watched Melissa and Jason being led away in custody, I couldn't stop thinking about that text message. The one that had warned me about the digitalis, that had somehow known the police were outside, that had arrived at the exact moment I needed it most. Detective Kowalski stayed after the arrest team left, helping me clean up the disrupted dinner while I tried to process what had just happened. The recording device worked perfectly, he told me as we loaded dishes into the dishwasher. We got everything we need, her admission about the digitalis, the threats against your safety, Jason's knowledge of the criminal enterprise. This case is solid. Detective, there's something I need to show you. I pulled out my phone and showed him the text message I'd received during the confrontation. His expression shifted from satisfaction to concern as he read it. Mrs. Chen, this is the same number that contacted you at the funeral? Yes. And there's no way Melissa could have sent this message. She was standing right in front of me when it came through. He studied the message for a long moment. Someone else is involved in this case. Someone who's been watching you, protecting you, feeding you information. But who? And why? Before he could answer, my phone buzzed again. Another message from the same unknown number: meet me at Woodland Cemetery tomorrow at 2 p.m. Richard's grave. Come alone. It's time you knew the truth about everything. Detective Kowalski read the message over my shoulder and immediately shook his head. Absolutely not. You're not meeting some unknown contact at a cemetery. It could be anyone, another member of the criminal organization, someone trying to eliminate loose ends. Or it could be someone who's been trying to help me all along. Mrs. Chen, I understand your curiosity, but... Detective, someone has been protecting me throughout this entire investigation. Someone warned me at the funeral not to trust my children. Someone just saved my life by warning me about the digitalis. I need to know who it is. We argued about it for 20 minutes, but eventually Kowalski agreed to a compromise. I could go to the cemetery meeting, but undercover officers would be positioned throughout the area. I'd wear a wire, carry a panic button, and if anything seemed dangerous, the police would intervene immediately. That night, alone in my house for the first time since Richard's death, I sat in his study and tried to make sense of everything that had happened. My husband had been murdered by my daughter for insurance money and to prevent his testimony in a federal money laundering case. My son had been complicit in the cover-up, if not the murder itself. Both of my children had been prepared to kill me to protect their secret. But someone else had been orchestrating my protection, feeding me information, guiding my investigation. Someone who knew intimate details about the murder plot, about the police investigation, about the exact timing of tonight's confrontation. Someone who had access to information that should have been impossible to obtain. The next afternoon, I drove to Woodland Cemetery with my heart pounding and questions multiplying in my mind. The undercover officers were invisible to me, which I hoped meant they'd be invisible to anyone else who might be watching. Richard's grave looked exactly as it had the day we'd buried him, a neat rectangle of still settling earth with a temporary marker bearing his name and dates. But as I approached, I could see that someone had been there recently. Fresh flowers lay beside the headstone, and there was a small envelope tucked beneath them. I picked up the envelope with trembling fingers. My name was written on it in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a key and a note: Storage Unit 247, Pine Valley Self-Storage on Route 9. Everything you need to understand is there. Mrs. Chen. I spun around at the sound of the voice, and what I saw made my knees nearly buckle. It was Richard. Not exactly the Richard I'd been married to, but close enough that there was no mistaking him. He was thinner, his hair was shorter and darker, and he wore glasses I'd never seen before. But it was unmistakably my husband, standing 20 feet away from his own grave. Hello, Dorothy. I couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. The man I'd mourned, whose murder I'd been investigating, whose body I'd supposedly buried, was alive and standing in front of me. I know this is a shock, he said, moving closer carefully, as if I might run. I know you have questions. I know you probably hate me right now. You're supposed to be dead, I managed to whisper. I was supposed to be dead. That was the plan. But plans change when you discover that the people you trust most are planning to actually kill you. He gestured toward a bench near his gravestone, and somehow I found myself walking toward it, sitting down beside the husband who had supposedly died in our bed 6 weeks earlier. Richard, I don't understand any of this. If you're alive, who did we bury? Why did you let me believe you were dead? Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me what was happening? He was quiet for a long time, staring at the headstone that bore his name. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with regret. Dorothy, everything I did was to protect you. Everything. The money laundering, the fake death, letting you discover the truth about Melissa and Jason, it was all to keep you safe. Safe from what? From the people I'd been working for. From our children. From me. He turned to look at me directly, and I could see tears in his eyes. I've been laundering money for some very dangerous people for over 15 years. When I tried to get out, when I agreed to cooperate with the FBI, they made it clear that everyone I cared about would pay the price. So you faked your death? I tried to. The plan was that I'd take the digitalis in a carefully controlled dose that would mimic death but not actually kill me. Melissa was supposed to arrange for immediate cremation before anyone could examine the body too closely. Then I'd disappear with a new identity while you collected the life insurance and lived comfortably for the rest of your life. But something went wrong. Melissa went wrong. I didn't know she'd been planning to actually kill me and collect the insurance for herself. I didn't know she'd been positioning herself as my business partner so she could take over the money laundering operation. I didn't know that Jason was helping her. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. So when you took the digitalis, she'd switched it for a lethal dose. If I hadn't suspected something was wrong, if I hadn't substituted a mild sedative for what I thought was a controlled amount of digitalis, I would have died that morning just like she planned. But the body in the coffin. A homeless man who died of natural causes the same night I was supposed to die. Melissa had connections at the funeral home through her event planning business. They helped her with the substitution in exchange for a substantial payment. I stared at this man I'd been married to for 43 years, trying to reconcile the loving husband I'd thought I knew with the criminal who'd been lying to me for decades. Richard, why didn't you just tell me the truth? Why did you let me think you were dead? Why did you put me through 6 weeks of grief and investigation and nearly getting killed by our own daughter? Because the only way to protect you was to let you uncover the truth naturally, in a way that would give the FBI enough evidence to prosecute everyone involved. If I'd just disappeared, Melissa would have eventually found a way to eliminate you as a witness. If I'd told you the truth from the beginning, you might not have been convincing enough in your role as grieving widow. So you used me as bait. I used you as the hero of your own story, he corrected. Dorothy, you were magnificent. You investigated like a professional, you gathered evidence like a detective, you risked your life to expose murderers and criminals. You saved yourself. With your help. You sent those text messages. He nodded. I've been watching over you every step of the way. I have contacts in law enforcement who kept me informed about the investigation. I knew when you were in danger, when you needed information, when you needed protection. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us staring at the headstone that marked the grave of a stranger. Finally, I found my voice again. Richard, what happens now? You're legally dead. I'm legally a widow. Our children are going to prison for trying to murder both of us. What kind of life can we possibly have? He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. The storage unit key will lead you to evidence of every crime Melissa and Jason committed, every transaction they made, every plan they had for taking over the money laundering operation. There's also documentation of my cooperation with the FBI and proof that I've been working to bring down the criminal network from the inside. That doesn't answer my question. Dorothy, the FBI has offered me a place in witness protection. A new identity, a new life, complete safety from the people who wanted me dead. But I can't take you with me unless you choose to come. The magnitude of what he was asking hit me like a physical blow. Leave everything I'd ever known, my home, my friends, my entire identity, to start over with a man who had lied to me for decades. You want me to disappear with you? To become someone else entirely? I want you to have the choice. For the first time in our marriage, I want you to have all the information and make your own decision about what kind of life you want. I looked around the cemetery, at the peaceful hills and ancient trees that had been the backdrop to so many family visits over the years. Then I looked at Richard, alive, real, asking me to trust him one more time after betraying that trust in ways I was still discovering. If I say no, if I choose to stay here and rebuild my life as Dorothy Chen, what happens to you? I disappear forever. You'll never see me again, never hear from me again. As far as the world is concerned, Richard Chin died in his bed on March 15, 2023. And if I say yes, we both disappear. We become new people with new names in a new place, and we try to build something honest together for whatever time we have left. The choice should have been obvious. This man had lied to me, used me, put me in mortal danger, and destroyed the trust that had been the foundation of our marriage. Any rational woman would tell him to disappear alone and never contact her again. But as I sat there beside his fake grave, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't ready to be alone. Not after everything I'd been through, everything I'd discovered about my own strength and courage. I wasn't ready to spend my remaining years grieving for a marriage that had been built on lies, or trying to rebuild relationships with children who had tried to kill me. Richard, if we do this, if we start over together, there have to be rules. Complete honesty about everything, your past, your crimes, your fears, your plans. No more secrets, no more protection, no more deciding what I can and can't handle. Agreed. And I want to know everything about the money laundering, about the people you worked for, about what our new life is going to look like. I want to be your partner in this, not your victim or your burden. Dorothy, I spent the last 6 weeks watching you investigate and fight and survive, and I've realized something I should have understood 40 years ago. You're stronger and braver than I ever gave you credit for. You don't need my protection. You need my partnership. I stood up from the bench and looked down at the grave that contained a stranger's body beneath a headstone bearing my husband's name. In a way, Richard Chin really had died that morning in March. The man sitting beside me was someone new, someone who'd been forced to confront the consequences of his lies and the strength of the woman he'd underestimated. What would our new names be? I asked. He smiled for the first time since appearing at the cemetery, and it was the same smile that had made me fall in love with him more than 40 years earlier. We get to choose, he said. We get to decide who we want to be. As we walked away from the cemetery together, leaving behind the grave and the life and the lies that had defined us for so long, I realized that this wasn't just about starting over. This was about starting right, with truth instead of deception, with partnership instead of protection, with eyes wide open instead of willfully blind. The storage unit Richard had mentioned contained everything we needed to put Melissa and Jason away for decades, to dismantle the money laundering network, to close the book on the criminal life that had consumed our family. But it also contained the keys to something I'd never had before, the chance to build a relationship based on complete honesty, complete trust, and complete understanding of who we really were. 3 months later, Dorothy Chin officially died in a car accident on a rainy highway outside Albany. The woman who survived that accident had a different name, a different history, and a different understanding of what it meant to love someone despite their flaws. As for the woman who had stood at that graveside and received impossible text messages from her supposedly dead husband, she learned that sometimes the most shocking betrayals lead to the most unexpected redemptions. And sometimes the people who hurt us most are the only ones who can help us discover who we really are. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to shed your entire life like an old coat, to wake up one morning with a different name and a different history, then you'll understand the strange mixture of terror and liberation I felt during those first weeks of being someone else. Margaret and Robert Sullivan moved to a small coastal town in Maine 6 months after Dorothy Chin disappeared in that staged car accident. We chose names that felt both familiar and foreign, close enough to our real names that we wouldn't forget to respond when someone called us, different enough that we felt like new people. The FBI had been thorough in creating our new identities. Social security numbers, driver's licenses, bank accounts, even medical records that showed a completely fabricated history of routine checkups and minor ailments. We were a recently retired couple who'd sold their business in Ohio and wanted to spend their golden years near the ocean. Our new house was a modest Cape Cod cottage with weathered shingles and a view of the harbor from the kitchen window. Nothing like the grand colonial we'd shared in Westchester County, but somehow it felt more honest. More like a home built for actual living rather than for impressing visitors. Robert, I still thought of him as Richard sometimes, but I was getting better at the mental shift, had changed in ways that went far deeper than his new name and hair color. The man who had spent decades keeping secrets from me now shared everything. His fears about whether our new identities would hold up under scrutiny. His guilt about the years he'd lied to me. His amazement at how well I'd handled the investigation that had brought down our children and saved both our lives. The trial had taken place while we were in transition between identities. I'd testified via video link from a secure FBI facility, my face obscured and my voice altered to protect my new identity. Watching Melissa and Jason in their orange jumpsuits, seeing them sentenced to 25 years and 15 years respectively, should have brought me satisfaction. Instead, it just made me feel hollow and old. Do you regret it? Robert asked one evening as we sat on our front porch, watching fishing boats return to harbor. Leaving everything behind to start over with a man who lied to you for most of your adult life? I considered the question seriously, the way I'd been considering everything since our new life began. I regret that it took a fake death and a murder plot to make us honest with each other. I regret that our children became people I couldn't recognize. I regret that I spent 40 years being protected instead of being trusted. But do you regret being here now, with me? I looked at this man I'd married twice, once as Dorothy Chen to Richard Chen, and again as Margaret Sullivan to Robert Sullivan. The second marriage was just paperwork and new identities, but it felt more real than the first one had. No, I said. I don't regret it. But I need you to understand something, Robert. I'm not the same woman who used to make pot roast and smile at country club dinners and pretend not to notice when things didn't add up. That woman died in a car accident outside Albany. I know. I liked her, but I think I'm going to love the woman who replaced her. The FBI had told us it might take 2 or 3 years before we felt completely secure in our new identities, before we stopped looking over our shoulders and expecting someone from our old life to recognize us. But the money laundering network had been completely dismantled, the key players were either in prison or in witness protection themselves, and there was no one left who had reason to hunt for the ghost of Richard Chen. Still, we were careful. We paid for everything in cash. We avoided cameras when possible. We didn't get too friendly with neighbors, though we were polite and contributed to local charities the way any retired couple might. But gradually, we began to build something that felt like a real life. Robert got a part-time job at the harbor, helping maintain boats for the summer tourist season. The work was physical and honest, and he came home tired in a way that seemed to satisfy him. I volunteered at the local library, organizing children's reading programs and helping elderly patrons with their computer questions. For the first time in decades, we went to bed each night having shared everything about our day with each other. No locked studies, no mysterious phone calls, no business trips that couldn't be explained. Just the ordinary intimacy of two people who decided to trust each other completely. On the first anniversary of Richard Chen's death, we drove to a lighthouse about an hour north of our town and sat on the rocks watching the sunrise. We'd brought coffee in a thermos and blueberry muffins from the bakery where Robert sometimes helped with deliveries. I keep thinking about the text messages I told him as we watched seabirds dive for fish in the harbor. The ones you sent me at the funeral and during the dinner with Melissa and Jason. How did you know exactly when to send them? I had help, he admitted. Detective Kowalski and I stayed in communication throughout your investigation. He'd let me know when you were in danger, when you needed encouragement, when timing was critical. You two planned the whole thing. We planned to keep you safe and gather evidence against the people who'd betrayed us both. But Dorothy, most of what you did, the courage, the intelligence, the persistence, that was all you. I just provided a little guidance at crucial moments. I leaned against his shoulder, something that still felt both familiar and strange. Do you think we would have made it if all this hadn't happened? If you hadn't been forced to fake your death, if I hadn't discovered what Melissa and Jason were really like? No, he said without hesitation. We were living a lie, and lies don't last forever. Eventually, the truth would have come out in a way that probably would have destroyed us both. So in a twisted way, Melissa trying to kill you saved our marriage? Melissa trying to kill me revealed what our marriage could become if we built it on truth instead of deception. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunrise paint the ocean in shades of gold and pink. A year earlier, I'd been Dorothy Chen, a widow grieving her husband's death and slowly discovering that her entire life had been a carefully constructed fiction. Now I was Margaret Sullivan, a woman who'd chosen to rebuild her life with complete honesty as the foundation. Robert, do you miss anything about our old life? I miss thinking our children loved us. I miss the illusion of being a legitimate businessman. I miss the house we raised our family in. He paused, considering. But I don't miss the lying. I don't miss the constant fear of being discovered. And I don't miss protecting you from truths you were strong enough to handle. I miss my garden, I said. I miss the roses I'd been cultivating for 20 years. I miss thinking I had a normal family. I miss believing that the people I loved most were trustworthy. But I don't miss feeling like a stranger in my own life. I don't miss being managed and manipulated by people who claimed to love me. And I don't miss wondering what my husband was really thinking when he looked at me. As we drove home that morning, past the familiar landmarks that were becoming genuinely familiar rather than carefully memorized, I realized something that surprised me. I was happy. Not the artificial contentment I'd maintained during my years as Dorothy Chen, but the deep satisfaction that comes from living authentically. The FBI check-ins had become less frequent, the anxiety about discovery had faded, and we were beginning to think of ourselves as Margaret and Robert rather than as actors playing roles. We had friends in town, not deep friendships, but genuine connections with people who knew us only as the quiet couple who'd retired to Maine and minded their own business. On quiet evenings, we'd sometimes talk about what we might have done differently if we'd had the chance to start over earlier in our lives. Would we have had different children? Would Robert have chosen a different career? Would I have been more assertive about my own needs and interests? But those conversations were philosophical rather than regretful. We were building something new together, not trying to fix something that had been broken beyond repair. The woman who had stood at that cemetery 18 months earlier, receiving impossible text messages from her supposedly dead husband, felt like someone I'd known in another lifetime. She'd been brave and intelligent and determined, but she'd also been operating from a place of grief and betrayal. The woman I'd become was operating from a place of choice and partnership and hard-won wisdom about the difference between love and manipulation. If someone had told me 5 years earlier that I'd end up in witness protection with a new identity, married to a former money launderer who'd faked his own death, I'd have suggested they seek professional help. But life has a way of taking you places you never expected to go, and sometimes those unexpected destinations turn out to be exactly where you needed to be. As we pulled into the driveway of our little house by the harbor, I realized that this was the first home I'd ever shared with someone who told me the truth about everything that mattered. And that made all the lies and betrayals and losses worth it. I'm writing this final chapter on a Tuesday morning in October, sitting at the kitchen table of our main cottage while Robert tends to his small vegetable garden outside. The harbor is quiet except for the sound of gulls and the gentle lapping of waves against the dock. It's been 2 years since Dorothy Chen died in that staged car accident, and 3 years since Richard Chen supposedly died in his bed in Westchester County. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never received those text messages at Richard's funeral. Would I have spent the rest of my life as a comfortable widow, never knowing that my husband was alive or that my children had tried to murder us both? Would I have eventually discovered the truth about the money laundering and the life insurance fraud, or would Melissa and Jason have found a way to eliminate me quietly and inherit everything? I suppose it doesn't matter now. What matters is what I learned about myself during those terrible months when my entire understanding of reality crumbled and had to be rebuilt from scratch. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, if you've listened to an old woman's account of betrayal and redemption and the strange ways that love can survive even the most devastating deceptions, then I hope you'll understand what I want to share with you now. The first thing I learned is that you can live with someone for 40 years and still not know who they really are. Richard wasn't the man I thought I'd married, But he also wasn't the villain I feared he might be when I first discovered his crimes. He was something more complicated, a man who'd made terrible choices while trying to protect the people he loved, who'd learned too late that protection without truth is just another form of betrayal. The second thing I learned is that the people who claim to love you most can be the ones who hurt you most deeply. Melissa and Jason weren't evil from birth. They were people who'd been corrupted by money and opportunity and the belief that they could get away with anything. The children I'd raised to be honest and compassionate had become adults who were willing to commit murder for financial gain. But here's the third thing, and maybe the most important: discovering that you've been lied to and betrayed doesn't have to destroy you. It can also liberate you. For decades, I'd been living according to other people's scripts. I'd been the supportive wife who didn't ask too many questions, the loving mother who made excuses for her children's behavior, the polite woman who smiled and agreed and never caused trouble. When those scripts were stripped away, when I had to figure out who I actually was beneath all the roles I'd been playing, I discovered someone I barely knew. I discovered that I was brave enough to investigate a murder conspiracy. Smart enough to gather evidence that would hold up in federal court. Strong enough to wear a wire and confront killers in my own dining room. Resilient enough to walk away from everything I'd ever known and rebuild my life from scratch. I wish I'd met that woman sooner. The fourth thing I learned is about the nature of justice. Melissa and Jason are serving their sentences in federal prison, and the money laundering network they'd hoped to inherit has been completely dismantled. From a legal perspective, justice was served. But real justice isn't just about punishment, it's about truth. The truth that my husband loved me enough to risk everything to protect me, even if his methods were misguided. The truth that my children had become strangers to me long before they tried to kill me. The truth that I'd been stronger all along than anyone, including myself, had realized. The fifth thing I learned is about forgiveness. I will never forgive Melissa and Jason for what they tried to do to me, to Robert, to our family. Some betrayals are too fundamental, too complete, to be overcome by forgiveness. But I was able to forgive Robert for the lies he'd told and the danger he'd put me in, because those lies came from fear rather than malice. He'd been trying to protect me in the only way he knew how, even if that protection had nearly gotten me killed. And perhaps most importantly, I was able to forgive myself for all the years I'd chosen not to see the truth that was right in front of me. For all the warning signs I'd ignored, all the questions I hadn't asked, all the times I'd chosen comfort over truth. Now, watching Robert work in his garden through our kitchen window, I think about the different kinds of love I've experienced in my 73 years. There was the passionate, naive love of my first marriage, which ended when I discovered that passion without compatibility is exhausting. There was the comfortable, willfully blind love of most of my marriage to Richard, which nearly got me killed when comfort became more important than truth. And now there's this, the clear-eyed, fully informed love I share with Robert. We know exactly who each other is, the good and the bad, the heroic and the cowardly, the wise and the foolish. We've seen each other at our worst and chosen to stay together anyway. It's not the sweeping romantic love of movies and novels. It's quieter than that, more practical, more honest. But it's also deeper and stronger than anything I experienced as Dorothy Chen. If I could go back and give advice to that woman who stood at her husband's graveside and received impossible text messages, I would tell her this: trust your instincts. Ask the hard questions. Don't let anyone convince you that you're too fragile or too naive to handle the truth about your own life. I would tell her that the people who love you will trust you with difficult truths, and the people who don't trust you with difficult truths don't actually love you, they love the version of you that serves their purposes. I would tell her that it's never too late to discover who you really are, and that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you is also the best thing, because it forces you to stop living other people's stories and start writing your own. But mostly, I would tell her what I want to tell everyone who's listened to this story: your life belongs to you. Not to your spouse, not to your children, not to your friends or your community or anyone else who thinks they know what's best for you. You have the right to know the truth about the people you love and the life you're living. You have the right to ask hard questions and demand honest answers. You have the right to walk away from anyone who tries to manipulate or control or protect you from reality. And if you ever find yourself standing at a graveside, receiving messages from someone who's supposed to be dead, don't assume you're losing your mind. Sometimes the most impossible things are the most true. 3 years ago, if someone had told me that I'd end up in witness protection, living under an assumed name with a husband who'd faked his own death, I would have laughed at the absurdity of it. But here I am, and I've never been happier or more authentically myself. The woman who was Dorothy Chen is gone, buried under layers of lies and betrayals and willful blindness. The woman who is Margaret Sullivan knows exactly who she is and exactly who she's chosen to love and exactly what she's willing to accept in exchange for security and comfort. The answer to that last one is nothing. I'm not willing to trade truth for anything anymore. If you're watching this from anywhere in the world, if you've stayed with me through this entire story of family betrayal and criminal conspiracy and the strange ways that love can survive almost anything, I hope you'll remember this: the truth may hurt, but lies will destroy you. Don't let anyone convince you that you're better off not knowing something that affects your life. Don't let anyone protect you from information you need to make informed decisions about your own future. And if you ever receive a text message from someone who's supposed to be dead, pay attention. Sometimes the impossible is just the truth wearing a disguise. Thank you for listening to an old woman's story. Thank you for staying with me through the dark parts and the confusing parts and the parts that probably seem too strange to be real. If this story has touched you, if it's made you think about your own relationships or your own willingness to ask hard questions about the people you love, then please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to know that these words have traveled the world and maybe helped someone else find the courage to seek their own truth. And remember, it's never too late to discover who you really are. It's never too late to start living your own story instead of the story other people have written for you. And sometimes, when everything you thought you knew turns out to be a lie, that's not the end of your life, it's the beginning of the life you were always meant to live. Thank you for joining me on this journey of discovery, betrayal, and ultimately, redemption. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support means everything, and I'd love to hear how this story resonated with you, wherever in the world you might be watching from.